you have your Bibles, challenge you to go ahead and pull them out. We're going to start off in Proverbs Chapter 6, then we'll end up in Acts 8. Last week we started, I guess, somewhat of a brand new series. I just felt like the Lord is just really pressing upon my heart to take not only what we're walking through collectively, but kind of the news of what we're dealing with, which it's coming at us almost like drinking water through a fire hydrant. It's just, the craziness is just increasing day by day, and I think we need to know how to have a biblical response and even a biblical outlook on what we're dealing with. And so I've just come to the place where I'm just taking what I'm dealing with, what you're dealing with, and praying and crying out and asking God for wisdom and direction, and how do we give a biblical response, and how do we respond to the current events that we find ourselves in. And so I've just simply entitled this message, Navigating Through Difficult Times. And in that, we're really going to look at a few things. We're going to see Satan's tactics this morning, because they don't change, his demise, and also those evil men or women that are allowing him to use them. And then I want to also look this morning at, as believers, what to expect. While I don't have a knowledge exactly what's going to happen, but we know what the end times entails, and then how we're to respond. So a very simple message, but I think one that needs to be spoken to the body as a way of encouragement and just to wake us up. And so we're dealing with a very dark cloud over this land, and let's be honest, it's been over it for a long time. It's just intensified. And I'm going to go ahead and say this again, as I've said over the last few weeks. I have no hope in any political figure or party. Okay? That ship has sailed a long time ago. So what I'm going to speak about, while we will talk some about current events, is not propping up a political figure or a party. There is no hope. If you're waiting for the military, or if you're waiting for a past president or whatever to step on the scenes and deliver you from all of your heartaches, then you are going to be waiting for a long time. Our only hope is in Christ alone, and that's who is our rock. Now, with saying all of that, I kind of want to take maybe one of the craziest, if not the craziest, news stories that was shared this week. As crazy as they all are, it's hard to put one above the other, because it's all just bizarre, this world that we're living in. But I had a lady in the church that shared an article with me. I'm sure many of you have seen this. It's in the New York Post, that Harvard has just hired a new chaplain, or literally the president over all of their chaplaincy for their university. If you haven't, it's in the New York Post. Here's the thing. He's head of the chaplaincy, but he doesn't believe in God. He's an atheist. Matter of fact, he wrote a book, and he believes that life's pretty good without God. And so this is the guy that's going to give any kind of direction that someone, especially maybe in a crisis, they're going to go to. And the argument is that most young people don't believe in God, and so they want to have someone that they can identify with, and this is the one that's going to give the overall direction to the chaplaincy with Harvard. So it just gets crazier and crazier. So how do we respond when we see this dark cloud seemingly getting darker and darker, let alone what we're dealing with this virus that seems to be intensifying? How do we respond? What is our outlook? What is going on? I believe wholeheartedly that we're definitely in the last of the last days, that God has removed his protective hand away from this nation. I think it's been removed for a while. We're just seeing this level of just oppression that's taken place. And it's not only happening here, but it's going to happen globally. I've said this before. I'll say it again. You may like it. You may not. It's okay. And you can disagree, and it's okay. But I think what's going on with this nation, as far as and globally, is a biological warfare that's been released on humanity, and there's a greater greater things that are trying to be accomplished here. And it's ultimately everything being set up for the Antichrist, I think, ultimately to come on the scene. And I think we're seeing the enemy work in overdrive. Matter of fact, one of the things that I've said over the last few weeks is that the longer I live and the older I get, the more I'm coming to realize that this world's less about physical and a whole lot more about spiritual. And it's the spiritual forces that are working in overdrive. And it's Satan. And while we can name some names and some figures that are on the national scene or global scene to realize, man, if it ain't the Antichrist, they got to be kin to him somewhere. We see this stuff, and we know, and we see the wickedness that's going on. But I want to remind you that it's not flesh and blood. It's not an individual that we're coming up against. It's the power of darkness that is blinding and has blinded blinded men. When I say men, I mean that universal, men and women, and is working in overdrive to bring much destruction, fear, and havoc in people's lives. And so in all of that, let me just say this to you. Satan's tactics have not changed. The way he operated and the way he's always operated, the way he operates now is the exact same. And so in Proverbs 6, Solomon says there's 6 things, a 7th that's an abomination of the Lord, that he hates. Well, the things that the Lord hates are these actions that are within men. And who empowers men to go in overdrive as far as within their own wickedness? It's the enemy. Now listen, as a fallen human being, we're capable of any sin. I mean, we're bent away from God apart from Christ. But when you put the enemy and the spiritual forces and this world and Satan as the prince of power and air, this enticing, we just see things go into overdrive. And so in that, most of us know these scriptures. It's a very simple message, but one that's just kind of saying out in the open what many of us are wondering in our heads or in talking about in quiet, in our homes. So the 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 which are abomination to him. Verse 17 begins to list these. Notice what they are. A proud look. Satan uses arrogant people. Now make no mistake about it, there's many believers that the enemy has sifted before in their pride and their arrogance that he's caused or used to cause havoc on humanity and that of the church. But as a believer, Satan's not going to possess us. He may oppress us. He may sift us and use us. But it's when we are living in that land of self-sufficiency and not dependency upon God. And I don't care how much experience you got. I don't care how much education you got. I don't care how much you know, that if you ever get to a point where you, and we all struggle with this, where you're like, I got this thing on my own, self-sufficiency, then we are prime for the enemy to use us. But when you take a lost person who is just eat up with arrogance, and we see that everywhere right now, don't we? The level of just not pride, but downright arrogance. By the way, in some ways, isn't what Harvard did by hiring this guy for this job, isn't that some way very arrogant towards God, almost like shaking their fist or their hand in the face of God, saying, we don't need you, and we don't need you for our students either. That's what we're doing as a nation. Understand that we have pushed God out of every facet of our society. He has no place in the public square. Matter of fact, the late Jerry Falwell said when 9/11 happened, he made the comment, and I won't quote it verbatim because I don't know it verbatim, but he said something to the effect that maybe what happened in 9/11 was God's judgment upon this nation because of her sin. And if you remember that, for those that were of age, if you remember that, I mean, the media, they just eat him alive. But I'm going to be really honest with you, I don't think he was too far off. Because what's taking place here right now, with what we're facing, God has removed his hedge of protection from this nation. And it's been removed for a while. We're just seeing this to the level that we're seeing it. We haven't won a war since when? World War II. Why? Because we've said to God, we don't need you. And in that, the enemy is coming in and he's using lost and wicked people, and no doubt crippling the church with their apathy and their idols, our apathy, our idols, let's put ourselves there. And he's destroying us as a nation. And not just as a nation, this stuff's going on globally. And so there's this proud look, a lying tongue. You know, we're at a place right now in society where we do not know what to believe. We're at a point that we don't believe anything coming from Washington. And let's just throw all parties in there, right? We're at a point that we don't really trust anything that's coming from the media. And let's not just put mainstream media there. Let's take the podcasters. You know, the ones that so many of us listen to that have some things that really resonate, make sense, but then they like go way out in left or right field. We're like, whoa, wait a second. I was with you until you started talking about aliens. I was with you until you started talking about the fact that John F. Kennedy Jr. is still alive. That kind of stuff. Right? So it's like, what do you believe? Now, we're at a point to where we don't even just question politicians. We don't even just question the media news source. By the way, Satan's the prince and power of the air, right? We are getting to the point to where we are questioning the medical profession, and that is no knock on anyone that serves in there. There are good people that are pouring their lives out. I'm just telling you where we are as a society. What is this? Is the vaccine good? Is it not? I mean, why can't, you know, why is there very little flu and this, that, and the other? What is going on here? And this isn't something that's controlled at the ground level. It's like, what's going on up here? And once again, that's no knock. We've got plenty of people that are on the front lines that are pouring their lives out in people, and I'm thankful for that. All I'm saying is that the enemy is working in overdrive so much that we're questioning that. And you know what else? And we're right there on the brink of it. We're going to begin to question our military. What's going on here? What's happening? And as this thing makes a full circle, literally what the enemy's doing is he's dividing, because if you notice this, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, verse 18 says, a heart that devises wicked plans, and feet that are what? Swift into running to do evil. And then verse 19 says, false witnesses who speak lies, and one who sows discord among the brethren. There is so much division that we don't know where to go as a people group or what to believe. And there's so much that's just out there. If you're not careful, the ultimate place that the enemy wants to get you is where you begin to doubt this. And he's been working on that for ages. By the way, the person that's 35 and older, you grew up with it just being a norm that this was the bedrock truth, and it is. And it stood the test of times, and it's been tried, it's been tested. But for that generation of Harvard-age students and below, they're not raised that way. And many of them are not examining, and if they do, it's through Google, and that's not really examining and testing the scriptures. And so as we walk through this and we see these tactics of how the enemy is trying to, literally, if you think about it, every segment of our society is in overload right now. Overload. And he's doing everything he can to get us to the place of where we question everything and we turn on one another and we destroy one another. And that's how the enemy works. He likes to bring together in order to divide. And when you divide, then it's easy to conquer. And that's where we are. Have you ever wondered why in the world that we don't have any cities that are being burnt down right now? You know why? There was nothing more than a militia. I'm telling you, God has removed his hedge of protection from this nation and is globally tied together where there is much going on. And Satan is working in overdrive, and he is the ultimate one that's behind this. So these are his tactics, and I could go and spend a whole message in literally depicting every one of those, but as we read through those, in your mind, you're like, yep, that's happening, seeing that. So let's not spend an overwhelming amount of time there, but let me just, at least for encouragement's sake, from this standpoint, let me show you what Solomon says their demise is. Notice what verse 12 says. He says, a worthless person, a wicked man. And by the way, the worthless person, the wicked men, are the ones that really are describing, that are doing the 7 things that the Lord hates. He says he walks with a perverse mouth. He winks and with his eyes, he shuffles his feet, he points with his finger, very charismatic, very manipulative, but perversity's in his heart because his heart's not right. He devises evil continuously. And what does he do? He sows discord. Remember, the Lord hates these things. There's times we have to take stand against false teaching. There's times we got to draw a hard line in the sand. That's not the same. Standing for truth, this is what we stand for. It's not the same as sowing discord. Verse 15, it says, therefore his calamity shall come quickly, and suddenly he shall be broke without remedy. Satan uses individuals as well as organizations to accomplish his purposes. When he is done with them, then he just drops them. I'll give you a prime example from the New Testament. Judas Iscariot, full of greed and idols. Satan entered into his heart. He betrayed the Lord. He brought much discord. When Satan was done with him, he was overwhelmed with what? Grief. And what did he end up doing? Committing suicide, taking his own life. Don't think when you see individuals that seem as if they're just getting away and there's no repercussion for their actions, whether globally, nationally, or even just on the here and now, that the God of justice is just turning a blind eye to it. He's not. Let me say this without stutter or stammer. There is going to be a day of reckoning. And even in all of this clutter and chaos of what we're calling life right now, God is keeping an account, and there will be justice. So just understand his tactics. He loves to lie, so don't be so gullible. He loves to sow discord, so don't get caught up in it and be used by him. He loves all of those tactics and to suck people in. But the church has to be tender as a dove and wise as a serpent. Never forget when I was a youth pastor and I was going through my real first troubled season in ministry, where I had people that were just kind of coming against me because of growth and things of that nature. And I couldn't tell you what he looked like, didn't know who he was, but he was a minister that was connected to a church family member, and he was passing by, and I had preached that Sunday, and he walked out of the church door and he shook my head, and even though I can't visually remember what he looks like, I don't even know who he was, but I remember his words, and they were powerful to me. He said, brother, if you're going to make it in ministry, he said, you're going to have a tender heart. He said, but you're going to have to develop thick skin. Friends, I want to tell you something. If we're going to count for the gospel's sake in this world, we got to grow some thick skin. But we can't grow hard, callous hearts either. We got to have tender hearts towards each other and towards the things of God. the enemy wants a callous heart. And that's what he's working in overdrive for. So when you get to Acts 8, in the first 4 verses, we were reading through this on Wednesday night in our Zoom group. And this just spoke to me so much about what we're going through and what to expect and how to respond, that I just really wanted to share it with you this morning. So let me give you a little bit of the context, and then we'll walk through it from what to expect and what our response needs to be. The church was birthed, it's exploding. Not hundreds, thousands of people are coming to faith in Jesus Christ. But the greater God works, the more the enemy goes in overdrive. So if you think, or if I think, that we're going to pray for God to use us to do a work and we're not going to face much opposition, then we're sadly mistaken. And remember, we're talking right now about what to expect as a believer. Expect persecution, hardships, and heartache. It comes with the territory. Because we're in a battle, literally, of the souls of men. And so, in chapter 6 and 7, there's a man by the name of Stephen that is just a mighty man of God. He is sold out. He is going all in. He knows what it's like to meet with Jesus. He knows what it's like to walk with Jesus. He knows what it's like to preach and proclaim Jesus. He knows what it's like to be anointed by God. And the Spirit of God is all over this guy in such a powerful way that Satan sifts the religious leaders all over again. And they end up stoning him to death. And in that, well, what flows out of that is what we see in Acts 8. So, notice what it says. It says, now Saul, which we will know later became Paul. So God can use some of the most least likely people and bring them to salvation. So we don't know who God may save through whatever it is that we're walking through. But it says that Saul was consenting to his death. That's Stephen's death. But notice this. At that time, a great persecution arose against the church which was at Jerusalem. So what happened? God's moving mightily. The enemy goes in overdrive. Persecution came. And it says that they were all scattered throughout the regions from Judea, Samaria, and everybody left except what? The apostles. So, notice what verse 3 says. We'll come back to verse 2. It says, as for Saul, he made havoc. That's what the enemy does. He loves to use people to bring havoc in our lives. So much that he entered into every house, dragging off men and women and committing them to what? Prison. What's going to happen when it becomes so dark here that it's going to cost you mightily to be a follower of Jesus Christ? I've said it before, I'll say it again. The day and age of the church being a thing that's going to help you out in your career, or to be something for financial gain, which should have never been, those days are gone. And I don't ever see them coming back. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. Church as we know it will not go back, I don't believe, let me preface it with that, than what it was before. And I think it's going to radically change over the next 18 months to 2 years with what's before us, because I don't see any light on the horizon. I see much darkness ahead of us. And I think God's going to accomplish several things. I think, one, He's going to begin to purify His church in her preparation for Him coming back. But two, I think God is also allowing the stage to be set up for the Antichrist to walk on the scene. As we read through this and we see what took place in Jerusalem, it makes me think of Afghanistan. I mean, it's one thing to say, man, it's tough right now. I don't like what's happened politically. I don't like the pressure that's taking place. My heart is grieved. I don't like what's going on. And I'm losing some of my rights and my freedoms. But none of us have gotten to the point to where literally our lives are in jeopardy because of the gospel's sake. Or that somebody's showing up at our house. And the reason the church is mostly full of apathy towards these things is because we see it on TV, we see it maybe somewhere out in a distance, but it hasn't showed up on our doorsteps yet. I'm going to tell you that if the Lord tarries, unless there's some major awakening that takes place, but why should He? When our culture is more like what they're doing at Harvard than it is with what's going on here today. So if it's going to get darker, sooner or later it has to show up at the doorstep. I think if the Lord tarries long enough, the church will go back underground. Because the enemy is much about making havoc. And it's going to separate. It's going to separate those that want to stand on the truth of Scripture. Now, if you want to throw out most of the teachings of the Bible and have the world in one hand and try to have God in the other, which you're not, you'll be fine. Because you're no threat to the enemy and you'll go along with whatever. Listen, make no mistake about it, there will still be a Southern Baptist convention once the rapture takes place. And there may even be a Red Dam Baptist church, but you'll be looking for a new pastor. Some of the deacons still may be here, but you may... I'm just picking. I was just seeing if Lloyd was awake. But it'll still be here. But when you stand, you become a threat for the enemy. You know, I can't help but think as we walk through this and we think about what they were going through, what the church is facing in Afghanistan today. What do you do? Knowing that any moment that someone may show up at your door and not only take your life, but take your children's life. That it may cost you every single thing that you have. Your life. The most important thing. What do you do? I promise you this. Whatever money the government's pumping in our lives to keep us occupied in our idols won't matter. I promise you the toys that we just got to have won't matter. As I said several weeks ago, God's not whispering to us. He's screaming at us. And I realize preaching and saying some of the things that I'm saying, as I said in the last service, I know good and well that there may be, and there's a highly likelihood, there may be some people that may walk out and say, I don't want to listen to that ever again, and I'm done, and walk out. I hope that's not your response. So I don't say that cynical or arrogant, but let me be really honest. You can walk out and say, I don't want to ever listen to him again because I think he's off his rocker, and I don't want to deal with this. And you may want to go dig a hole in the sand and put your head in it. But let me be clear. That does not change your circumstances. And it's not going to change them. This is where we are. In every sign, the alarm is going off saying it's going to get worse. So be prepared. And you're prepared by drawing closer to Christ. That's your ultimate step. Your ultimate step. The thing about this early church in Acts is that they had experienced the resurrection of the Lord. And that should be what you've experienced if you're here today. And if you haven't, I hope the Spirit of God is drawing you to. But when you've had the encounter with the resurrected Lord, it should bring you to a place to where you can stare death down. Figuratively speaking, eyeball to eyeball. And these guys, they would make death blink. Because they knew this world, it was fade, it was passing. There's nothing here that's going to bring lasting happiness. The only thing that matters is relationships. And they went all in. And I'll say it again, I am absolutely blown away that in In Acts 4, when they prayed, they did not pray for the opposition to go away. No, they prayed for boldness to get even louder. Oh, for the day when the church will come alive and let go of our idols and kick them out of our lives and say, God, give us boldness that we may step out and we may proclaim. We may be more about investing in people and seeing the gospel go forth than we are about our comfort. So in one sense, I don't know what's before us. If you want to know my opinion and what I'm examining, I think it's going to get much darker. And I think God is at work. Now here's the cool thing. If you go back to verse 1, it says that there was a great persecution that rose against the church that was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. Now, if you were to go back to Acts 1 and look at verse 8, you can outline the whole book of Acts with the Great Commission that Jesus reiterated at the beginning of Acts. Go ye therefore make disciples, right? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the utter ends of the earth. First 12 chapters of the book of Acts starts in Jerusalem, goes to Judea, Samaria. Paul comes on the scene, has an encounter with the resurrected Lord, takes the gospel to the nations. Now that's a broad outline, but you can outline the book of Acts that way, big picture. So here's my point. God is accomplishing his purposes, and he's working through the early church even though Satan is working in overdrive. When we were talking through this on Wednesday night, one of our church members piped in and made a very powerful observation. Says, as I'm thinking through Acts 8 and I'm seeing how the gospel's going forth, even though Satan is just wreaking havoc, he said, could God be doing the same thing in Afghanistan? Here you have this church, the underground church that was thriving, and many were coming to faith, and all of a sudden they are just being inundated with just all these spiritual attacks, and they're being scattered and misplaced and displaced and all of this stuff going on, and they're having to stand and have boldness. Could it be that God's taking that people group and dispersing them for the gospel to go forth? You see, the human mind doesn't think like that, but the Spirit, when he begins to see that, it's like, whoa, God, what are you doing? I mean, how many times have we seen tragedy in our own lives, personal tragedy, and God do something really supernatural through it to bring other people to himself? God is more interested in people being saved than he is about our comfort. So, with saying that, look at verse 2. It says, and devoted men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation. There was great grief over him. Remember, Stephen was this mighty man of God. He was just a man that was full of the Spirit. The Spirit was just had control over him. And in some sense, you could look at it that he died in his prime. Now, we're at a time right now, just dealing with where we are. There is a lot of sickness, and it seems to be a lot of death. Now, I don't say this to give you fear. I hope that this message will give you boldness, but I'm going to be really honest with you. I think there's going to be a lot more death. And I don't necessarily think that death's just going to be like from COVID. There's just much wickedness that's going on. It's in an overdrive. And we are seeing God set the stage. So there's much catastrophe. I mean, when you get into the tribulation period and you see how much loss of life there is, it's mind-boggling. By the way, as a side note, I'm reading through the book of Joshua. And Joshua is the political, military leader, spiritual leader that God's leading Israel to conquer the known land to where Israel could be set up. And in that, he's judging the nations. And in that, there was much loss of life. When you think through that and you go back and you look at what's taking place or going to take place in the tribulation period, all of that's kind of parallel for when Jesus is going to come. And in that, there is much loss of life. We live in this like fairy tale land where we just think that everything's just going to be okay because we live in this little isolated thing, and it's not reality. And we're getting jolted into reality. And most people don't know or won't know how to handle it or want to deal with it. And so, when the Stephens of this world, God snatches them out and carries them home, it does leave a void. So do not let me minimize that. And it hurts. And in many times, in many cases, we don't understand what he's doing. I can only imagine what the church is saying right now is like, God, Stephen had all this wisdom and all this gifts and all this talent, and you were just blessing him and you were using him and people were coming saved, and all of a sudden he's just snatched off the scene. Why, God? We don't know why, but we know that God, whenever he removes, there's a purpose. And we can begin to expect it. But in that we can trust him. And here's what I gleaned from the early churches, that they trusted him. God, we may not understand every facet and every detail of why you do what you do, but you are a good God in whom can be trusted. Even when we walk through some stuff and you even remove some people out of our lives and it doesn't make sense at all. And we're beginning to, we see some of that now in our own lives. And we don't understand. But we can trust him. We can trust God because he's good. And so, expect these things. Expect darker days. Expect persecution. Expect even loss of life. Even those that are some of the most godly people you may ever meet. It still doesn't mean that God's not doing his thing and accomplishing his purpose. And it certainly doesn't mean that we should walk around in fear and live in just complete terror. You know, one of the ways that the enemy is dividing right now is over this shot. I get everybody's attention now. I mean, this is so divided. 52% of Beaufort County has been vaccinated, and obviously the other 48 or other portion has not. And there's this great discord that's even into the church. On one hand, if you get vaccinated, what are going to be some of the health repercussions? And if you don't, then you're not loving your neighbor. You know what? I've got some strong convictions, but also know the tactics of the enemy. He wants to bring division. And here's what I know, just as Stephen, when Stephen's time was up, it was up. And if Stephen was vaccinated or not vaccinated, guess what? It was his time. So let's major on what needs to be majored on, and that's the gospel, and staying focused on the Lord. We can have healthy conversations, but don't let the enemy sift, and don't let him sift you with fear. Do not be overcome by fear. That's not of God, it's of the enemy. If you want to wear a face mask when you come into work, by all means, church, wear it. And if you don't, it's okay, don't. Doesn't mean you have less faith than the other or vice versa. It just means this is kind of where you are, and that's okay. But let's focus on what needs to be focused on, and that's quit shooting one another and destroying one another and trying to just divide and all of those things. And let's walk by faith and let's trust God. Like I said, I have strong convictions about a lot of things, but I'm not going to divide for the sake of dividing, right? I want to focus on what I'm called to focus on, and that's the gospel, and it's how to refresh the hearts of the saints so as we walk through these perilous days to where we stay true to God and focus on Him, and we tune all this other nonsense out to the point of it crippling us from being the men and women that God's called us to be. So, how do we respond? Last point, very simple, and I think it just speaks volumes of the early church. Therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere doing what? Preaching the word. You know what's interesting is that the apostles stayed in Jerusalem, but the body dispersed. And as the body dispersed, the church grew. That tells me that the responsibility of Acts 1:8 wasn't just for the apostles, it was for the body. And this mindset that it's the responsibility of the professionals, let me tell you something, there is no professional. The one who comes and says, I'm the professional Christian, stay away from them. I don't care the years, I don't care the age, I don't care the pedigree, degree, whatever, stay away from them. Life is about the Christian walk, dependency upon God, not self-sufficiency. If you will humble yourself down, if you will seek His face, if you will stay in this Word, the Spirit of God will lead you in all truth. It's just that simple. And as we go, we become very intentional in sharing our faith. Very intentional in pouring our lives out in people. So, some practical things for you, and what we're going to spend a few moments praying about before we close this morning, is this. When we hear the word or see the word preaching, we think, well, that's what you do. I'm not called to preach, to stand up and proclaim. I want you to think of this. I've said several times that the church is not going to look the same. And there's radical change that's taking place even within our culture. We're ultimately going to get to that place of dispersion again, which we should have always been there. And what it's going to look like in some ways, I believe, is that as you go out, you seek to invest and build relationships with the people in this world. Not just for the sake of ramming the gospel down their throat. People know if you're a salesman. Salesman pitches don't work. Authentic, genuine relationships work. And you seek to build relationships, and in those relationships, the doors will open for you to minister and to articulate why you're doing what you do. And in some cases, it'll happen fast. In other cases, it will be a long journey. But nevertheless, the gospel will go forth. But we have to become intentional. I'll give you an example of me just this week. I told you a few weeks ago that I lost a childhood friend that I hadn't seen in probably 15 plus years, and really just died a tragic death. And I was at that funeral. My heart was gripped because I looked around, and so many people that I knew as a childhood, they were just in a dark place. You could see the darkness over them. And I left that funeral, and I'm telling you, I was grieved because I felt like that not only did I leave them and not come back, but I that's it. I just didn't go back. And so I started praying. I'm like, God, give me one person from my childhood that I can go back just to invest in. One person. And God put a person on my heart and in my life, and I reached out to him and went to lunch with him just this week and just shared life with him. And when I went in there, I was saying to myself, you're not going in there and overload them and like you're trying to just get him somewhere. You're going to go in there and you're just going to love. And you're going to seek to know what's going on in their world. It's not about that I've got all the information and I need to download it on you. No, I genuinely care about you, and I want to build an authentic relationship with you. And as we share life, we'll talk about these things because we're going somewhere, but I want to be led by the Spirit, not by Kevin. And you know what? That takes time. It takes energy and it takes effort. We were talking about some of the things that we were doing that was going on in my life, and he asked me this one question. He said, how do you ever have time for yourself if all this is going on? And it kind of took me back. And my response was, I have time for myself, but what energizes me the most, with all actuality, is being about my Father's business. I didn't say that to him verbally, but that's what my mind... As a believer, that's what we're about. It's people. Investing in people. You got to have that alone time to get recharged. You can't give out what you don't take in. But man, if you're taking it in, it's got to come out. This idea, you just want to pray and you don't want to do anything and you just walk real slow. I've never met a person that prayed a lot that never went to action. If you pray, I promise you, you'll go. So the church is scattered. They went about preaching. Guys, we have the only message. So I'm going to say this as an application. There is a virus that has spread globally, and it's impacted every single person in the human race for all time's sake, and it's called sin. And we have the only answer. We have the only remedy, and it's Jesus Christ. So why in the world aren't we being intentional? And why are we not investing in everything we have in the one thing we can't lose? And that's the gospel of Jesus Christ. Dark days ahead? Yes. Opportunity for ministry greater than they've ever been? Absolutely. The question is, are you willing to take up your cross and to follow him at all costs?